going to now focus on some of the changes in the food system in the late Anthropocene and look at the radical transformation of agriculture in the last 100 years. This slide illustrates some of the many changes that have accompanied the industrialization of agriculture. The impact of human interference with the ecosystem, of course, goes back to the very beginning of agriculture 10,000 years ago. But it's really in the last century that we have greatly accelerated the impact of our food production methods on the environment. What do we mean by industrialization of food production? It's a system for agriculture based on the principles of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. Mechanization, efficiency, speed, uniformity, standardization, with an emphasis on increasing throughput. In agriculture, we've seen a shift toward monocropping, meaning large acreage planted in a single plant variety such as corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton. The heavy use of inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, water, groundwater with irrigation systems, and a large reliance on fossil fuels. The Union of Concerned Scientists has defined industrial agriculture as viewing the farm as a factory with inputs such as pesticides, feed, fertilizer, and fuel, and outputs such as corn, chickens, and so on. The goal is to increase yield, measured by bushels per acre or pounds of animal flesh for inputs of feed, and decrease cost of production, usually by exploiting economies of scale and externalizing costs to the environment. By externalizing, we mean not including in the retail cost of a product the true cost of production. So if there's great degradation of the environment, if you produce an unhealthy diet that causes a lot of disease in the consumers of that diet, and those costs are borne by the healthcare system or by the public expenditures to deal with environmental degradation, those end up being externalized costs. With the industrialization of our food, we have come to a food system that, since the Second World War, has relied heavily on fertilizer production. We had a situation where in 1909, two German scientists, Haber and Bosch, invented the procedure that allowed extraction of atmospheric nitrogen and fixing it as ammonia, the ingredient of nitrogen sources, nitrates for both gunpowder and for fertilizer. Post-World War II in the United States, we had large munitions factories that had been fixing large amounts of nitrate for use in our weapons, and suddenly these plants were idle. They were converted to production of synthetic fertilizers, and the amount available at a very low cost to the American farmer escalated rapidly. These conditions now allow us to have heavy inputs without capturing those true costs, high resource use of soils, water, energy, the environmental consequences of degradation of our water systems, pollution by fertilizers and pesticides, and soil loss lead to the big dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, all of the other attendant problems of environmental degradation. We have artificially inexpensive fuel and water, and I say artificially because, once again, if you don't really account for the cost of exploitation, if these externalized costs are not captured in the cost of the product, it appears as though indeed we can have our cake and eat it too. Agricultural subsidies, the Farm Bill, which had its origins in 1933 at the depths of the Depression and served mainly to support farmers through the Depression, to stabilize prices, and to assure an adequate supply of food for the American people. But in the early 1970s, when Earl Butz was the Secretary of Agriculture, a totally new approach to farm policy was introduced, and farmers were encouraged to plant hedgerow to hedgerow, fence row to fence row to maximize productivity, forget about stabilizing prices, and rely on government financial incentives. The USDA is caught in an awkward situation of having dueling roles. On the one hand, its main purpose has been to promote U.S. agricultural products, exports, and has been an important part of minimizing our balance of trade deficit for the last 30 or 40 years. Another section of the USDA is responsible for developing the recommended daily allowances of foods for the American diet and providing nutrition education. And as we'll see later on, the policies that are promoted by these two branches of the USDA are frequently at odds. The transformation of American agriculture has been characterized by the decrease in the number of farms, shown in that blue line that peaks at about 1935, and the green line, which is the average size of the farm. For many years, from about the time of the Civil War until post-World War II, the average size of the American farm was around 160 to 170 acres. We're a quarter of a mile square section as the farm belt was developed during the 19th century. Now we have increasing size of farm and decreasing number of farms. This has led to overall little change in total land use for agricultural purposes, but dramatic changes in rural communities. With these mega farms, we have seen a hollowing out of many, many rural communities where the local seed store, the local mechanic, the local farm equipment supplier has gone out of business to be replaced by more remote sites for large sales of farm equipment that sometimes exceeds $1 million in cost. In addition to the change in the size of the farm, we've had a rather dramatic shift in the distribution of farms. The top map here shows how poultry processing plants were distributed in 1949, and each of those little black dots represented a plant that processed 50,000 or more chickens each year. By 2007, each of these dots now represents a poultry processing plant producing more than 1 million chickens per year. And of the 8 billion, with a B, chickens that are raised in the United States each year, that's about 1 million chickens every hour, 24/7, 52 weeks a year. We've had tremendous consolidation of poultry production and poultry processing in what is now called the broiler belt, running from East Texas through the south on up to the Delmarva Peninsula and mid-Atlantic coast. The concentration of farms in larger and larger operations distributed in narrower and narrower sections of the country has also been accompanied by a shift from diverse and resilient to highly specialized. The turn of the previous century, we had about 5 commodities per farm. So you might have a small farm of 150 acres where perhaps a flock of 50 to 75 chickens, maybe 20 or 30 pigs, a couple of fields of alfalfa, some wheat, some sweet corn, all being produced at a level sufficient to have at least 5 commodities available for commercial sale. In the early 2000s, we had shifted to the point where now it's barely over 1 commodity per farm. So you might have a 2,000-acre farm in southern Illinois or northern Iowa that is producing nothing but corn one season and then soybeans the next in the typical corn-bean crop rotation. With this specialization, of course, has come the loss of biodiversity and increased vulnerability to extreme weather events.